In the first week of August 2026, a handful of diplomats sat down in Muscat to talk about a waterway, not a war, not a nuclear program, a waterway. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, had become the fulcrum of a conflict that started in February and had already reshaped how the United States thinks about its own military power. And somewhere in the quiet arithmetic of that reshaping, a much larger question was taking form, one that had almost nothing to do with Iran at all. While American attention, American ships, and American munitions poured into the Gulf, another theater 7,000 miles east was being watched by a country that had spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this kind of moment. This is a story about what happens when a superpower's focus narrows at the very moment its rival's patience widens. To understand why a set of talks in Oman matters to the Indo-Pacific, you first have to understand what those talks actually are. Since late February 2026, the United States and Israel have been engaged in open conflict with Iran, following strikes on Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. What began as a rapid campaign turned into a months-long war of attrition. Missiles, drone strikes, a naval blockade, and a series of ceasefires that kept collapsing under their own weight. By August, American officials were speaking 2 languages at once. Publicly, there was talk of a deal within days, a reopening of Hormuz, a diplomatic off-ramp brokered by Oman with support from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Privately, the picture looked more strained. Reports emerged that the United States had burned through a large share of its interceptor stockpile for a key missile defense system, leaving commanders describing the Pentagon's munitions reserves as dangerously low. That single detail, interceptors, not headlines, is where this story actually begins. Militaries do not measure overstretch in press conferences. They measure it in inventories. An aircraft carrier strike group has a finite number of missiles it can fire before it must sail home to rearm. A Patriot or THAAD battery has a finite number of interceptors before its crews are, in the most literal sense, out of ammunition. When a nation commits those finite resources to one theater, it is making a choice, whether it announces that choice publicly or not. Every missile launched over the Arabian Sea is a missile that cannot be surged to the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, or the first island chain running from Japan through the Philippines. This is not a hidden truth. It is basic strategic logic, and it has a name that predates this conflict by more than a century. The problem of overextension, the risk every great power faces when it tries to project decisive force in more than one region at the same time. History offers a blunt lesson here. Imperial Germany faced it in 1914. Forced to fight a 2-front war it had spent decades trying to avoid through careful, almost obsessive planning. Japan faced it in the early 1940s, stretching its navy across a Pacific too vast for the resources it actually had. The Soviet Union faced a quieter version of it in Afghanistan in the 1980s, pouring resources into a war on its periphery while its broader strategic position eroded elsewhere. None of these comparisons are perfect, and it would be a mistake to treat any of them as a prophecy. The United States in 2026 is not the Soviet Union in 1985, and Iran is not Afghanistan. But the underlying mechanism, a great power's attention and material capacity being a finite resource, not an infinite one, is a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of states that tried to do everything everywhere at once. Now place China into that picture. For more than a decade, Beijing's military planners have organized their strategy around a single, patient assumption that the moment American power is most vulnerable is not when it is weak, but when it is distracted. China's own doctrine documents and state media commentary have repeatedly emphasized the idea of seizing strategic opportunity, a phrase that shows up often enough in Chinese strategic writing that Western analysts have taken to treating it as a genuine organizing principle rather than boilerplate. It does not mean China wants war. Available evidence suggests the opposite. Beijing's economic model depends heavily on stability, on open shipping lanes, on continued access to global markets. But it does mean that Chinese planners watch American deployments the way a chess player watches an opponent's clock, not their pieces. Time, attention, and materiel are the resources that matter, and all 3 are currently being spent in the Gulf. This is where the phrase in this documentary's title comes from, the idea of a trap. It is worth being precise about what that word does and does not mean. There is no evidence of a secret alliance between Tehran and Beijing, engineered to draw American forces into the Middle East. No credible reporting suggests coordination of that kind, and it would be irresponsible to claim otherwise. What analysts mean when they use a word like trap is something more structural and less conspiratorial. A set of circumstances that benefits one party, regardless of whether that party caused them. China does not need to orchestrate a crisis in the Gulf to benefit from one. It only needs patience. Every week that American carrier groups, missile defense systems, and diplomatic bandwidth remain fixed on Iran is a week in which the Indo-Pacific receives less of all 3. Consider the practical picture. The United States maintains a rotating presence in the Indo-Pacific, built around a handful of aircraft carriers, expeditionary strike groups, and forward-based air wings in Japan, Guam, and increasingly the Philippines. That presence was already stretched thin before February 2026, a product of years of budget debates, shipyard backlogs, and a fleet that critics on both sides of the political aisle have described as too small for the missions assigned to it. Add a sustained Middle East campaign that consumes carrier deployments, munitions, and the attention of the National Security Council, and the math becomes uncomfortable. It is not that American forces have vanished from Asia, it is that the marginal ship, the marginal interceptor battery, the marginal set of diplomatic hours in the Oval Office is now more likely to be allocated to the Gulf than to the Taiwan Strait. Some analysts believe this is precisely the kind of moment China has been waiting for. Not necessarily to invade Taiwan, which remains a far larger and riskier undertaking than any single deployment shift could enable, but to intensify the lower cost pressure it has already been applying for years. That includes expanded air incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, more assertive patrols around the Second Thomas Shoal and other contested features in the South China Sea, and diplomatic pressure on smaller regional states to hedge away from Washington. Other analysts push back on this framing entirely, arguing that Beijing's own economic troubles, a property sector still working through the after effects of years of deleveraging, a labor market strained by youth unemployment and slower growth than the government's official targets suggest, make this an unlikely moment for China to court new international risk. It remains unclear which of these readings will prove closer to the truth, and intellectual honesty requires holding both possibilities at once, rather than choosing the more dramatic one because it makes a better story. There is a psychological dimension here too, one that rarely makes it into policy briefings, but shapes decisions all the same. American strategic culture, going back to the Cold War, has generally struggled with the discipline of theater prioritization. The instinct in Washington, across administrations of both parties, has often been to treat crises as they arrive, rather than to rank them in advance and accept the costs of deprioritizing the less urgent one. This is not a partisan critique. It shows up under Republican and Democratic administrations alike, and it reflects something structural about how a global power with global commitments actually behaves under pressure. Iran is loud, immediate, and now literally shooting at American assets. Taiwan and the South China Sea are, for the moment, quieter. Human institutions, including national security bureaucracies, are wired to respond to the loud problem first. China's planners are not naive about this tendency. If anything, it is one of the more predictable features of American behavior that a patient rival can plan around. It is worth pausing here to steelman the opposing view fully because it deserves serious treatment rather than a dismissive aside. There is a coherent argument that the Gulf conflict, far from weakening America's Indo-Pacific position, could ultimately strengthen it. A decisive resolution in the Middle East, one that stabilizes Hormuz, reduces the ongoing drain on American resources and demonstrates that Washington can still project overwhelming force when it chooses to, might restore rather than undermine deterrence credibility in Asia. Some defense officials and commentators have argued precisely this, that showing resolve in one theater signals resolve everywhere, and that allies in Tokyo, Seoul, and Manila are watching how America handles Iran as a proxy for how it would handle a crisis over Taiwan. There is real historical precedent for this argument as well. Britain's ability to project power in multiple theaters simultaneously during parts of the 19th century rested partly on a reputation for follow-through that discouraged challengers from testing it in the first place. If the United States ends the Iran conflict on favorable terms and rebuilds its munitions stockpiles quickly, the overstretched story told in this documentary could look, in hindsight, like a temporary strain rather than a structural shift. The counter-argument to that steelman is not that it is wrong in principle, but that it depends on variables nobody currently controls. Reputational deterrence only works if the underlying material capacity to back it up is actually rebuilt, and defense industrial capacity does not scale quickly. Interceptor and precision munition production lines that were already running behind demand before this war will not simply catch up because Washington wants them to. It appears, based on reporting about depleted stockpiles, that the United States is drawing down faster than it is replenishing, and closing that gap could take years rather than months, regardless of how the diplomacy in Oman resolves. A reputation for resolve, in other words, is only as durable as the hardware behind it. There's an economic layer to this story that connects the two theaters more directly than most coverage acknowledges. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a significant share of its liquefied natural gas. A prolonged closure, or even partial restriction, sends ripples through global energy markets that reach Asian economies with particular force, since China, Japan, and South Korea are among the largest importers of Gulf energy. This creates a strange asymmetry. China has a direct economic interest in the Gulf conflict ending, even as it may have a strategic interest in American forces remaining tied down there. Beijing's own diplomats have at times offered to play a mediating role in Gulf tensions, framing themselves as a stabilizing counterweight to what they describe as reckless American escalation. Whether that framing reflects a genuine desire for stability or a calculated effort to build regional goodwill at Washington's expense is again a matter on which reasonable analysts disagree. Meanwhile, the human costs of this overstretch are not abstract. For American service members rotating through the Gulf on extended deployments, the war means longer separations from families, more strain on already thin readiness rates, and equipment cycling through maintenance faster than planned. For families of Indo-Pacific allies, from Taipei to Manila to smaller Pacific Island states, it means watching Washington's bandwidth narrow at a moment when regional anxieties about Chinese assertiveness have not gone away. And for ordinary consumers across the world, energy price volatility tied to Hormuz has already pushed up costs in ways that ripple through everything from shipping to household heating bills. Geopolitics, however abstract it sounds in a briefing room, eventually shows up in a grocery bill or a deployment schedule, and that human dimension is part of what makes the strategic stakes here more than an academic exercise. So what happens next? There are several plausible paths, and honesty requires laying them out without pretending to know which one will unfold. One path sees the Oman-Qatar brokered framework hold, the Strait of Hormuz reopen in stages, and the broader denuclearization track move forward slowly over the following year. In this scenario, American forces gradually rebalance back toward the Indo-Pacific, though the munitions and industrial base take longer to recover than the diplomatic headlines suggest, leaving a residual vulnerability window that persists into 2027 and beyond. A second path sees the talks collapse again, as they have several times already since February, triggering a renewed and possibly wider round of strikes. In that scenario, American resource commitment to the Gulf deepens rather than eases, and the Indo-Pacific rebalancing this documentary describes gets pushed further into the future, with unclear consequences for how allies in the region read American reliability. A third, less discussed path involves a partial settlement, enough to reduce active combat without resolving the underlying nuclear and regional proxy disputes, creating a long, simmering standoff that ties down a smaller but still meaningful share of American attention indefinitely. Similar in shape to how other unresolved Middle East conflicts have persisted for decades without full resolution. None of these scenarios guarantees a Chinese move on Taiwan or a major crisis in the South China Sea. It is entirely possible that Beijing continues its current strategy of gradual, incremental pressure rather than any dramatic escalation, calculating that slow accumulation of leverage carries less risk than a sudden shift that could unite regional states against it. It is also possible that domestic Chinese economic pressures constrain Beijing's appetite for external risk-taking regardless of how distracted Washington becomes. The evidence available in early August 2026 does not point clearly toward any single outcome, and any documentary that claims certainty here would be overstating what anyone actually knows. What does seem clear, based on the pattern visible across this conflict so far, is the structural reality of finite strategic bandwidth. A nation, even one with the largest defense budget in the world, cannot indefinitely sustain a high-intensity commitment in one theater without consequences for its posture in another. The interceptor stockpile numbers are not a talking point invented for dramatic effect. They are a hard constraint, the kind that shows up in supply requisitions long before it shows up in a headline. And constraints like that do not care about press conferences or diplomatic optimism. They simply exist, and they shape what options are actually available the next time a crisis erupts somewhere else. This is, in the end, a story about the difference between attention and capacity. Washington's attention can shift in a day with a single tweet or a single phone call to an ally in the Gulf. Its capacity, its ships, its interceptors, its production lines, its diplomatic bandwidth moves far more slowly on a timeline measured in months and years rather than news cycles. China's strategy, to the extent it has one in this moment, does not depend on predicting exactly how the Iran conflict ends. It depends on a simpler bet that a superpower's capacity, once drawn down in one place, takes longer to rebuild than its rivals need to make use of the gap. Whether that bet pays off is a question the next several years will answer, not this documentary. History is often shaped long before the world realizes it has changed. The real question is not whether the talks in Muscat succeed or fail, but whether the strategic bandwidth America spends resolving them ever fully returns to where it was, and who else has been quietly counting the cost of its absence.